You guys will go ahead and take your Bibles and turn to John chapter 12, verse 1. That's John chapter 12, verse 1. If you're not used to your Bible, John is in the New Testament. It goes Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and then you go to the 12th chapter, verse 1, where we'll be at this morning. If you guys have been with us, we've been going through the Gospel of John clearly since the first part of the year. Took a break for Easter. We are now entering the 12th chapter, and there's a reason why we do this. Is that you guys, I think we'll be able to see this as we go through this story this morning. This is why we go through books of the Bible. Is that it's really hard to understand John chapter 12 without knowing what John chapter 11 has said. And you can keep going backward with what John chapter 10 has said. And then once we kind of get to the passion piece of the Gospel of John, it'll be able to make more sense of why the passion is even happening. And if you guys would just look at those first few words with me in John chapter 12, verse 1, 6 days before the Passover. Okay, that's all we have to read for just a second. If you guys have been following with us, and the way that the progression has happened is that everything previous to now has been happening for roughly 3 years of Jesus' ministry, of him being baptized, beginning his public ministry with the opening miracle of water to wine, all of these different things happening, and now we're 6 days before the cross. That's what he means by 6 days before the Passover. And so virtually the rest of John, it's going to be covering kind of a day at a time up until it's actually the night before his crucifixion, and that takes even more time before he actually gets to the cross. And so that's the way that it's being covered. But I do want you guys to see the time frame. And again, this week we need to know what John chapter 11 has said before we actually get to John chapter 12. But before we get going with that, I do want to throw up a quote on the board just real fast. The board, they're TVs now. They're not boards, okay? But as Kevin DeYoung wrote this in Just Do Something, his book, and it says this: decide comes from the Latin word decide, whatever it says, but meaning cut off. That's essentially what you need to pay attention to. Whenever we make a decision, something else is going to be cut off, which explains why decisions are so hard these days. We can't stand the thought of cutting off any of our options. If we choose A, we feel the sting of not having B and C and D, and as a result, every choice feels worse than no choice at all. And if you go ahead and just go past that now, but this is something that whenever it just comes to making decisions in and of itself, we tend to be able to find freedom in having choices. It's like, I'm not stuck with this specific thing, and so therefore I am free, which I would actually argue biblically, I believe, that once you make a choice, then you are more free than what you were beforehand, because you have now made a choice. And let me try to illustrate this just by telling you mine and Sarah's love story real fast, okay? It's like it kind of goes like this: that I was a junior in high school, she was a sophomore in high school, and she was dating the quarterback, of which I was not, okay? And so at some point, we started talking and progressed to this. We had talked for about 4 to 5 years, and this would have progressed into my sophomore year of college, her freshman year of college. And she was playing volleyball down at Moore, and I happened to know, because of my friend that I was very, very grateful to get to know, that all of these guys were saying things to Sarah like, just because there's a goalie doesn't mean you can't score. And I was beginning to think, I was like, she's having too many options. Okay, I think I should be the option. And I began to plot the way that I was actually going to marry her, or ask her to marry me. And so, you know how we think things should be sporadic and then on camera. Even at that point, I had decided, or she had told me that if you're going to ask me to marry me, marry you, that I want it to be on camera, but I want to be surprised. Okay, and so I cracked up a plan. All right? She thought I was going to ask her over Christmas break, and so boy did I surprise her. And so 2 months before that, I had bought a ring, $787, which is pretty cheap for some people's rings, not for other ones. I really thought I was broke, and I wasn't that broke, okay? But anyway, I bought it, stuck it in my waistband, and wore a baggy hoodie, and we went to the mall, and we got into a photo booth, okay? And I asked her to marry me while the photos were being taken, and I still have the photo proof of how surprised she actually was, okay? She did end up saying yes with all of us, but could I tell you how old I was while I was making these plans? I was 20 years old, okay? Now, one of the things that I love about my wife is that she really doesn't get caught up with a lot of monetary things. But even that $787 ring, which is worth a lot less than that at this point, she will not take off or part with. Now, I'm going to tell you that she has told me before, I wish you would have asked me in a different way. But she has never ever said that I wish that we never got married. Okay? And one of the things that comes with choosing to follow or choosing to pour out your love on somebody like that we did cut off all other options. And then we felt the freedom of knowing what it's like to pour into each other. There are no other options at this point, but this is something that whenever you actually fall in love with Christ, and so I have a direction for this, by the way. Whenever you actually fall in love with Christ, I want to tell you that you may look as clumsy as I did at 20 years old, trying to figure out how to pour out my love and devotion to somebody that I did indeed love. It's like, but even with that, the reception of that love, but not only that, for what is going to come after the fact. And the costly devotion of what it takes to be in marriage and to get to pour yourself into it, you find freedom in that costly devotion, which is the title of our sermon this morning. And so whenever we go into this text, I'm going to show you somebody that is enslaved to their desires, and I'm going to show you somebody who has been set free because they have found Christ to be who He has claimed to be. And that's why we're going to read verses 1 through 8, and then we'll begin to break this down. But verse 1, it says this. We will read verses 1 through 8. And it says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at table. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag he used to help himself to what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." I do find it necessary to read all 8 verses for us to kind of see the progression of the story, but we're going to focus on verses 1 through 3 first. If you guys remember, again, we've already talked about this is 6 days before the cross. There's a lot that has happened recently, as in Lazarus being raised from the dead. And they make reference to him there of saying that of whom Jesus had raised from the dead. You just kind of keep wrapping your mind around that for a second. There was a guy who used to be dead, now eating with Jesus. Do you see how much of a reversal that is whenever you're thinking about the spectacular power of Christ? But it also continues to be able to show us where he was at. He's in Bethany again. He's near Jerusalem. If you guys remember back in our story, there has been people wanting to kill him in this vicinity, and Jesus continuously goes back there just to be with friends and whatever it might be, but also probably for this story to happen. I'm not really for sure about it, but Jesus is back in Bethany. This is a place that it's really not safe for him to be, but there's a lot of people there. Verse 2 talks about the second sibling that's typically on the list, and that's Martha. as she was going around serving and whatever else. And again, if you're well acquainted with Mary and Martha, Martha is known for serving, while Mary is known for being at Jesus' feet. But Martha is serving without complaining. And then obviously Lazarus is there. And so if you guys will kind of get the picture, this isn't like going over to one of your guys' houses. You guys have a dinner table, sitting in your dining room of whatever it might be, and you guys are sitting at chairs or whatever it might be on the benches. That this is actually quite a bit different of a scene. That whenever I look at the pictures and I read about how they do this, just does not look comfortable to me. I don't think I want to start doing this, okay? But there would be a shorter table right in the middle, and then they would actually have pillows laying closer to the table, and the people would lean on their elbows and be able to grab food over here, but they would just be resting on their elbows. I don't know how long you guys can rest on your elbow, okay? I didn't test it for me this week. I just know I can't do it as long as these people probably were. But this is the way that they were dining, and everybody was laying in that way. But here's the third sibling again. Mary, being known for being close to Jesus and being near Jesus' feet, as it says, as she has listened to him teach in the past, as she has spent many times with him or whatever else. Guys, if you think about what the other Gospels teach about Mary and where she found herself often, I just don't think that this specific incident that I'm about to tell you was something that just happened with one occurrence over Jesus raising her brother Lazarus from the dead. But rather it is actually a span of a period of time of being with Jesus, recognizing him for who he is, and then all of a sudden she sees his power and the weight of him just raising her brother from the dead. And then the next thing you know, she feels that her love and devotion needs to be poured out for this guy. Okay? And so in verse 3, she takes a pound of expensive ointment. Again, reading in the other Gospels, an alabaster jar. So that is something that you would actually have to break the jar in order for you to be able to use it. But the flavor was pure nard, or more fun to say from the King James, spikenard, right? Whenever we went to Rhode Island, we found ourselves in the middle of Massachusetts somewhere. I'm not really sure where we were. But there was the Yankee Candle Factory there. Okay, and I called Sarah and said, hey, I'm in the Yankee Candle Factory. They have like 2,000 flavors. I said, do you want me to bring one home? She said, no. Okay. I said, but she said, I don't really want a candle. And I said, well, that's fine. But I'm going to tell you, one of the scents that they did not have there, though I didn't go read every one of them, was spikenard. Okay. This isn't something that sounds pleasant, but it is still something that was a very expensive scent of that time that some of the Romans would use to be able to kind of anoint their head, or to be able to use it as cologne, so if you will. But to be able to use it all at one time was actually a practice that they would actually do whenever somebody died in order to help kind of mask the stench just a little bit for a longer period of time. Okay? And so whenever Mary is thinking about how to pour out her love and devotion, she found something to pour out, okay? And so it is this expensive ointment. And so as Jesus is reclining at the table in this way, she walks in, breaks the jar, as Matthew says, that she began dumping it on his head. But as John says, if you guys look with me now, that she anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and then the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Okay, so as Matthew shows, began on his head. Evidently, she was so overwhelmed with emotion or something that it ended up being his feet, that she's dumping this expensive ointment out and wiping it with her hair. Maybe you're asking about how much. Does this actually cost? Well, that's why we read the whole thing completely, or the whole passage here in verse 5, that the ointment could have been sold for 300 denarii. What does that mean for you guys? It's about a year's wages for these people. Roughly, because they live in a poorer society than what you and I are used to, still in today's society, it had been worth about $10,000, okay? But that's all the amount of money that they were actually living off at that time, okay? At that time of what they were living off of. And in our day, again, about $10,000 may be a sixth of your salary, and maybe a tenth. I don't know, okay? But to be able to make this applicable, if this was worth about a year's wages for her, let's just say whatever the amount of money that you make in a year is how much that this ointment costs, just for your personal application. But essentially what she's doing is dumping out $10,000 worth of something to never be used again. All right? And so whenever we're thinking about this, there really isn't a lot of us that look for reasons to go spend $10,000 just to seemingly waste it on the Lord Jesus Christ. But I think that this is also something of whenever we begin to see where we spend our money and what we think is worth it and what we spend our time doing, we begin to see where our heart is longing, what our heart is longing for. Some of you wouldn't bat an eye at spending $10,000 on whatever your hobby is. Others of you, it's like maybe your hobby is just hosting your family. It's like you never count the cost. Whenever it comes to hosting your family, it is absolutely worth it. But see where the affections of Mary are being drawn to. Look nowhere else but the man who is reclining at this table, and that is where her affections are going to. It's as if there's just a single source of where her love and affection could be poured out, and all of a sudden, there is no reason to count the cost anymore. Whatever she pours out is going to be worth it because Jesus in her eyes is absolutely worth it. But again, this is something I just want to be able to throw out there, that whenever you spend plenty of time with this Christ and this Jesus, He should do nothing but become more beautiful in your eyes the more that you are with Him. Whenever you actually spend time in His Word and you have set aside this time in the morning before you do anything else, I promise that whenever you are applying your heart to the things of Christ, I promise He will become much bigger and more beautiful in your eyes and much more worth it to sacrifice for. You spend that time in prayer, it'll happen the same way. You spend that time in church with His people, it will be the same way. But it becomes something of no longer are we counting the cost because Jesus Himself has become worth it to us in our eyes. Okay? And so, whenever you're thinking about this passage, it really does happen just one time, doesn't it? Well, maybe a couple of times. But to Mary, there was no cost that was too great for her to pour out her love and devotion with something that we think is wasted. But with that, as Mary has anointed Him, there are people who are going to question. Okay, just like some of you guys may have questioned my approach to how I have showed my love and devotion to Sarah to get our marriage started. Maybe, perhaps it seems awfully clumsy. It seems very impractical. It does not seem the way that it's supposed to be. And so, in verse 4, Judas Iscariot pipes up and begins to question Mary's approach to her love and devotion towards Christ. And again, it says one of His disciples, Judas, who is about to betray Him, asked the question, why would we not have sold this and given it to the poor? But then his motive, this is always wonderful about John, I think that he always tells us the motives of people some way, or not always, but he does have notes of showing us the motives of people. But he says he didn't care about the poor, but he cared about the money that he had. And so he wasn't worried about the poor. He was worried about being able to have more money to be able to take more of. Now this is something that whenever the questions come up, we don't tend to like to think of ourselves as Judas Iscariot, do we? The ones that who are against the spiritual things or against the spiritual things that Christ may ask us to do, or those crazy things like dumping out $10,000 and seemingly burn them. By the way, I'm just kind of curious how much money was burnt over the weekend. Okay, is it, if you will, through the fireworks? Mine was just $125, and the boys thought it'd been way worth it to spend much more to burn. But anyways, for the boys, their new game lately has been Sonic and Shadow and these different guys. And you want to know who has to be Shadow, the villain? It's never them, okay? So we got three boys, and so there's Sonic, there's Knuckles, and then there's Tails. They never want to be the villain, okay? And it's like, of course, why would they want to be the villain? Because then they wouldn't get to look like the hero. It's a natural thing for us to not want to be able to look like the villain, but I also naturally don't want to be the villain. And so if I have to be the villain every single time, I think it's only fair they do it every now and again. And it seems to ruin the game for them, just as it ruins it for me just a little bit. But whenever we're thinking about what Judas is doing here, he is questioning the waste of the money. And if I was to just tell you guys that if I was to ask you to tithe 10% of all of your wages or whatever it might be, there's many people who would question that and say, that just seems crazy. It seems impractical. Perhaps if I was to ask you guys to commit to support a church plant in a very lost place on the other side of the world to where we're giving more than 10%, but 20% of whatever the church is actually making, that seems extremely impractical because we don't ever actually get to see the tangible things of what God is doing. And so whenever Judas is questioning this, he's not questioning... He thinks he's questioning the monetary impracticality of it, but rather what offends him is the very spiritual application of somebody who is longing for Jesus Christ himself. Now, if you guys have followed Jesus for any amount of time, not only have you been able to resonate with Mary that nothing is going to be too much for the cause of Christ, you should also have been able to resonate with Judas Iscariot whenever you have been offended by the spiritual things that God has asked you to do. Perhaps some of you, whenever I say fasting, you are almost offended. Even somebody might ask you to do that. Or prayer, or sharing your testimony, or the gospel, or something of the like. Those things just don't seem like something you want to practice in, even though the Lord says, if you are going to follow me, these are some of the things that all people will be doing. But if you're questioning these things, we don't understand what the practicality is of them, you desire to be able to have the things that you desire, whether they be fleshly. If we were to turn back and talk about Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, we've already gone over this, by the way, but Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money, or mammon, as the King James says. I cannot think of a better example of that than what we're reading about here in John chapter 12. Do you see that it's not really a money problem, it's a God problem? It's not really this, are we going to have enough money? It's, how can I get more money? Okay, do you see what Judas is drawn to? And so, whenever we're drawn to money, this is always going to be conflicting of what Christ is calling us to do, especially whenever we run across somebody that's being a Mary in our lives. Fully devoted, sold out, running towards Jesus with everything she has, and then we're starting to compare ourselves to her walk or their walk of whomever it might be in your life. And we begin to grow a little irritated of, surely God's not going to ask me to do those things. Surely God's not going to ask me to be that committed or that surrendered of whatever it might be. Do you see the offense that comes up almost very similar to what Judas is doing here? People who are running full speed to Christ often do offend the people who are not running, who would prefer to walk or sit. Okay? But this is the good thing about this is that Judas's heart is being revealed. Okay, just as our heart will always be revealed with this. But as Judas is serving two gods, I could not help but see some of the application not only for all of the United States, Southwest Oklahoma, but my own heart. My dad says that I am so tight that I squeak. Okay. It's like, he always says, you still have the same 2 nickels that you first got, okay? I said, of whatever that phrase is. And it's like, and you want to know something that I have to fight against to worship? Is the security of knowing that I'll have the money in the bank account just in case something goes wrong. That's why I'm tight. That I cannot worship that, though. I have to worship my Savior, and if He asks me to dump out $10,000 into a church plant of whatever that might look like, I should be able to say, like Mary, my love and my devotion belongs to you, Lord. And they said, and nothing else. Other people, they said, we're so addicted to getting to spend money. As I said, that maybe you just are so addicted to getting to spend money, whether it be $25 a day. If you think about how much that actually costs you per year, you're more addicted to having stuff than you are to having the money in the bank account. Okay? Or if we were going to go Dave Ramsey's way of not only do we get out of debt, but we continue to build wealth. And so therefore we always have this or whatever it might be. Do you see what Judas is doing? He is asking a question in order to help himself build wealth. The United States of America could very well identify with Judas in more ways than what we typically allow ourselves to be. Just as I said to my boys earlier, we don't like to be the villain. But here's one thing that's really good, is that whenever you realize that you are a villain, that Christ has absolutely made a way for you to be brought back as a child of God. It's called the ministry of reconciliation, and we'll talk more about his death here in a second. Notice what he does, though, whenever he gives his excuse. He asks the question, and he asks the question strategically, doesn't he? This isn't one that is going to reveal it to on the onlookers, because the disciples may have been thinking the very same thing. Why didn't we sell that and give it to somebody? It just seems like a waste. But Judas is the one who asked it, but he asked it in a very clever way, again, to where he's masking, he's disguising his true heart, and he's going to be seen as wise in people's eyes whenever he asks the question. And we're really good about hiding our own sins and our own intentions and our own motives. Whenever I was in Nicaragua, this is the last time that we were there, and this guy who was a waiter in the middle of Managua, Nicaragua, he walks up, he spoke English, and he said, "I know French." And he fooled me, okay? Because he said some phrase in French that I didn't know what he's talking about, because I don't know French. The guy that I was with, his name's Mike, he answers him in French, okay? And then the guy, I realized he said the same phrase in French like 3 times, and then he walks off, and Mike looks at me smiling. He says, "That guy don't know French," okay? Do you not see that whenever we come close to people who are living out their faith and are in close proximity to Jesus, even though you're able to fool a good amount of people with your motives, you will always be exposed with time. Your true following, and as to whether or not you are following Jesus, will be exposed. You can only hide for so long. And so therefore, you especially don't like people who reveal your half-heartedness. Or that you especially don't like people who are burning with the fire of Christ and are showing how lazy you have been in the way that you have been following, because your heart belongs to money or to alcohol, or to your soul food, or whatever it might be. Whatever, I don't know, whatever it is. But it becomes very obvious what we are committed to whenever we are defending where we spend our money or end our time, or as to whether or not we have surrendered everything to Christ. But this is one of the cool things. Now that we can move on to verse 7, Jesus said to her, "Leave her alone," in front of everybody, "so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you do not always have me." Here's Jesus defending the one who has poured out $10,000. Okay, it is a spiritual sacrifice that he recognizes. But again, I told you guys about my clumsy way of asking my wife to marry me. Again, she has never once made me think that she was going to be unfaithful because of the way that I asked her to marry me. Which means I must be doing something right? Okay? But one of the things that she knew, and we have learned together, that we are both absolutely surrendered to the fact that we will be married to this one person the rest of our lives. And again, we find freedom in knowing that we get to pour our love out all into one person. Here, Jesus, he receives a very clumsy act of sacrifice. Perhaps she thought through it. I don't know. Perhaps it looked like a waste. I don't know. But notice what she does, though. She unwittingly prepares him for his burial. Matthew chapter 26 would be able to say, it was good. It would have been good that she saved this for my burial, but now she has prepared me, and I have paraphrased that. Prepared me for the day of my burial. What does that mean? In short, Jesus is as good as dead. He has been prepared with the ointment that they would be pouring on him to cover the stench of his body here in the next 6 days. And so, if we're thinking about God's will, God's provision, what God is calling people to be able to do, He has called us to live on mission. What was the mission of all of the world at this specific time, whenever Mary actually dumped this out, was that in 6 days, Jesus would be on the cross, dying for the sins of the world, not to stay dead, but to be resurrected on the third day. And as Mary is pouring out her love and devotion on Him, again, unwittingly, she joins in on the mission of Christ to be able to save all of the world. Now let's fast forward to our present time and begin to make application for this. Does it actually seem crazy then that if He has done all of these things and has came to save all of the world, that if you and I were to live on mission right here, right now, to be able to sacrifice in the spiritual ways of God in order to lead people to Him, we would be joining the mission that He has called us to be a part of that began in Acts. Okay? We begin to see how Christ is making a way to reconcile all people, those who may identify with Judas, in order to be brought to Him. But it did begin right here with how Christ is going to the cross in order to draw people to Himself. And so with this, $10,000 really isn't the main problem here, is it? But the spiritual sacrifices that we make in order to join Christ on His mission, that begins to become more costly to you and I than what money is, because if we're being honest, that we can give money and it really not cost us a thing. It's really not going to change the way that we live our daily lives, because we have plenty of it most of the time. We know that we're going to eat. We know that we're going to get to do X, Y, Z, or whatever else. But if we begin to live spiritually in the way that Christ has called us to in order to join His mission, that begins to cost us more than money does in and of itself. And so what do you mean? Well, let's just talk about fasting for a second and how much your day would be disrupted if you were fasting. If somebody needs prayer and that you have set aside this time for you to be able to pray not only by yourself but with other people, guys, how many, and don't show of hands, but how many of you just get embarrassed to pray in public because you're so worried about people watching you or whatever else? Again, if that's how you feel, what a sacrifice it would be in front of everybody to pray in public in order for people to be led closer to Christ, or just sharing your testimony about how you are saved. I think more people would be willing to give $10,000 than to share their testimony in public. Because I really think that our hearts are probably drawn to the easy thing of writing a check more than it is to do the more difficult thing of sharing our testimony of how we have been drawn back to Christ in order for other people to do that. Do you see how the spiritual always is going to cost us more than the monetary value that Judas is so worried about? The only reason why the money hurts is because we love that more than we do Christ Himself. But notice how Jesus defends the one who is willing to sacrifice spiritually. They say, what a waste. He says, what a beautiful thing. Okay? You can almost hear the words of Him flowing into her heart. Okay, whenever you sit down to be able to pray and you just done something very embarrassing, let me just testify that these words, or the words of Christ, comes flowing into my heart so that I am confirmed once again. That whenever we walk with Christ, He does not leave us alone. In John chapter 10, He promises to be our shepherd who defends us. And so right here in John chapter 12, He defends the one who has poured out her love and devotion for Himself. But with all of that being said, now look at verse 9. And this is how the chief priests are plotting against them. When the large crowd of the Jews learned that Jesus was there, they came not only on account of Him, but also to see Lazarus, whom He had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to put Lazarus to death as well, because on account of him, many of the Jews were going away and believing in Jesus. Can I just show you the effects of the presence of Christ all over again? Do you see how confronting He is to people who don't want to follow him? Do you see how much people are more than annoyed? They're irritated. They're ready to kill somebody who is just following him because of the presence of Christ is confronting their very beliefs, their worldview, and how that they operate in the world. Which means, why would you and I expect to get to live the way that Christ has called us to with his presence inside of us and not be in confrontation at least from time to time? We almost worship comfort too much to the point that we don't want to be in a confrontation and talk about why Jesus is the only way to heaven. Try to tell Lazarus that, okay? The guy that was dead and then was resurrected. Is that because of his very breath, somebody else is plotting to kill him. But this is because, I think, we worship this comfort so much, there is a cultural idea that is just floating around that even Taylor Swift, she has a song about that came out in 2019 that I do believe is called Just Calm Down. You know who the song is written to? It is written to Christians who are willing to share their faith with people who are living in a horrible lifestyle, a sinful lifestyle. She's writing to Christians saying, would you guys just calm down? Okay? Now, if any of you are a Swiftie, I would encourage you just to become a Christian, okay? And begin to follow Christ to where you're actually going to see life. But she is helping us believe an idea that goes something like this. Now, I know you believe that. This is what I believe. And if you leave me alone, I'll leave you alone, okay? The chief priests, they evidently don't believe in that because they're ready to make people believe what they're believing. But I'm trying to show you the trap that our culture is in is different than the one that they were in. Do you really think that we are called just to be quiet and just to calm down? Okay? We are talking about eternity. We are talking about how people are saved. And Jesus' presence in you will be confrontational because it is the way to life. And it will be something that confronts the way that other people believe. But guys, this is where the fear comes up. You say, well, I don't want to argue about that, but you're willing to argue about everything you think you know about. So this is going to be the challenge. If that is what the double standard that we use in our culture, I only argue whenever I know what I'm talking about, I would encourage you to get into the Word of God and sit at his feet as Mary does. And begin to learn these things so that whenever you go and speak, you know what you're talking about. Okay? Your faith will only be extended all the more, but this is something that we as a culture cannot do. We need to make time to be with Christ so that we are willing to make a sacrifice as Mary showed us how to be able to do that. Just being alone with Christ will drive you to that. But this is something that everybody who's going to do, and so already be ready for this. That something very similar to that probably what's happened to some of these students whenever they came back from Falls Creek. They had an encounter with Christ while they were down there. I watched it. But there's always a story that comes into my mind whenever I remember having to go home from Falls Creek, because many of them will say, I don't want to go home. I have never felt so close to Christ in my life. I just assume not go home. But probably something like this was waiting for them there, just like my grandpa would do to my dad, as my dad would tell me about. My dad would go to Falls Creek. My grandpa's not a believer. Good old boy, don't get me wrong. He was not a believer. And so what did he do whenever my dad got back? He would cuss him out right in front of people to kill the spirit as best way he can. Why? Because he's more offended by it. He's more uncomfortable by the very Spirit of Christ. He can't stand it, and so therefore, how can I kill it? How can I get it away from me? How can I kill the very life that's inside of this new Christian, this young man, or whatever it might be? And again, I would not be surprised that many of these students actually walked into something very similar to that. Or maybe their parents thought, this is just a phase. We'll starve it out. So let's distract them with something that I would rather do. I said, whatever it might be. And they're not helping them feed their faith. They're not helping them grow closer to Christ, and so therefore they kill off the Spirit of God inside of them. Guys, these things will happen whenever Christ is present in you by His Spirit. But do not lose heart, for you do know the one who has overcome the world. We can say like the believers in Revelation, for I have overcome by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of my testimony. What is your testimony? It was the very fact that you were like Judas, rebelling against Christ Himself until you saw yourself as what you are. You are a villain in need of saving from yourself. And so whenever Christ died on the cross, He not only saved you from yourself, but He gave you new life because He now lives inside of you. And all you had to do was look and believe that Jesus is the true Son of God who died on the cross and made a way for you to be forgiven. And you are forgiven indeed, so that you might have life in Him and Christ lives inside of you. This is what we must be able to learn how to feed in our life. And so now we just come to the last part of this week, of the sermon this week. If you guys would go ahead and move to that last slide, and there's a couple challenges on here. If you guys are wanting to take a picture or be able to remember this, this is something I just encourage you to do while you are alone with God Himself. Maybe you open this passage back up in John chapter 12 and look at yourself and look at it very seriously and ask yourself the very first question, do I relate more with those who are offended by the ways of Jesus, like Judas or the chief priest, or do I love the ways of Jesus and I'm really not offended by what Mary did? And the second one is, are you then ready to take a small step to sacrifice this week? Perhaps it's just fasting. I'm not asking you to go burn $10,000. To take 3, 4, 5, 6, 12 hours and just not eat something for a while so that you focus on Christ. You guys haven't been praying lately. If you just set 20 minutes aside before you start your workday. It's just a small sacrifice. Or share your testimony with somebody this week, whether they be a believer or an unbeliever. Share your testimony of how you were saved. And again, I already know some of the feelings that would come up whenever I'm getting ready to do that. I'm fairly fearful. What if they laugh at me? What if they don't want to hear about it? Guys, I'm going to tell you this, out of all of my days of living in Oklahoma, 31 years, I've never walked up to somebody who I said, can I share my testimony with you? And they flat said no. And I'm willing to bet it's going to happen. This is very similar to you of, yeah, sure. Well, so tell me about it. And you begin to know what it's like to walk with Jesus with your words, and not outside of the church, and not just inside of the church. Okay? But you guys make that commitment on your own, but right now we're going to pray. And if you guys would like me to pray for you, this is the time right after this that you guys will come forward. Lord,